You'll have to excuse the blanket, the weather has just changed and it's freezing. So what I wanted to talk to you about now was the way that we think during periods of stability and the way that we think during periods of instability. Because it's very, very different. We think very, very differently during periods of crisis. And we've just had an unprecedented period of stability. I don't think, like 70 years is actually a very long time. We've had a very long period of stability. And so the toxic tribalism that you see kind of caught in Aspic on Twitter, that little bubble that we've got, well, that's a demonstration of is a particular type of tribalism that we've been using as a stabilizer. And in fact, that tribalism has been one of our primary stabilizers since Thatcher kind of elevated the tabloids, and this is where it's all descended into. Now, the tribalism between left and right on Twitter is only possible with extreme levels of homogeneity, for a start, so you should know this. And it's what we call a narcissism of small difference. And largely what you need for this kind of tribalism, when you see this kind of this tribalism, and this is what we do naturally, we form this in every arena, we form this. Gangs are the same type of tribalism. It happens in prisons, it happens also in places, but when you see this kind of tribalism, you have two groups who are so similar that they've had to kind of almost magnify the differences between them. So what they do is they accuse each other of the things that they don't like about themselves and go back and forward. Now, when you witness that kind of tribalism, what you're always looking for, you want to know what makes them homogenous enough that that has developed. So here you've got a class, actually they're very male, they're very white, they're from very similar schools, very similar universities, and we're actually talking about a class structure. You want to know what turf they're trying to mark out with their tribalism. So when gang warfare takes control of a place, you want to look at the boundaries of the area that they're controlling and how that tribalism between them is forming a barrier for people within that. So you're looking at the boundaries that they're fighting over, the turf that they're fighting over. Now, what that tribalism is doing is about a very homogenous culture fighting for control of the right to control media narratives, which has largely been how we have had politics for about 30 years, because that's what they've been fighting for. They've been fighting for control of, that. Well, I'm afraid to say those days are kind of over. So all of a sudden, a social dimension has been added. They've been entirely protected by completely sealed off institutions, and one of the reasons that, say, Ash Sakar and James Butler and Laurie Penny, they don't know to hide that they believe that they can identify as someone's representation, because this is elite social closure that's 2-3 generations deep. The reason they don't know to hide this is because in their world it's normal, and then all of a sudden they've been ejected into a world where there's a social dimension. And the only way it's sustainable is if they introduce actual abuse and intimidation, and they've just gone round and round and round, and now they're locked in circles. Now, while that's not very nice for women like me who had to pay the price for that, it's actually broken the dynamic that upheld their power completely. So they're demonstrating all the time that they have no control over media narratives, that their tribalism is distorting their thinking, that they do not have capacity to have the conversation that we're going to need to have because of Brexit. But this tribalism has fit within the economics that we've had, which I spoke about in the videos about welfare economics, which has largely been about complex statistical models, chuck in some roles and some liberal values, and then an object like a single parent to project dysfunction, have a little bit of a maladaptive shame mechanism. And then this economics can shape everything, because the only people it really has to convince is this culture who control media narratives. This is not happening anymore. This is no longer sustainable. And one of the reasons that the symbolism of the lone parent is so interesting is because it's reproduced across academic institutions as well as media institutions, and it's been the core of this. And it's actually being used to hide from these other shifts you know, the changing role of women, changing family shapes, the fact that power dynamics are now, that used to be contained within families, are now a matter of legal and political responsibility, the emergence of looked after children whose entire life they will not have those kinship relations, and they are individuals where they will always meet the state throughout their lifespan. These things are very complex and cannot be considered within this statistical modelling and this static belief system. But this static belief system is excellent for periods of stability, when all you really need to do is find a new state scapegoat, and this will keep reproducing. And because you can bolster it with lots of disciplines which are identify as, this is what's coming out in the trans rights debate. But luckily this is pouring itself into a little self-contained bubble on Twitter that's sealing itself off with abusive behaviour, but we were already aware that they were not aware of this conversation. Now, if we go back to Hyman Minsky, he was of the belief that what Keynes was trying to set out in the 40s was then reabsorbed back into this theoretical economics. And what Thomas Piketty has just done that is challenge that with one stream of data. Now, the shifts that I'm discussing, the emergence of the care economy, the emergence of systems that link public and private spheres that are to do with labour that can't be abdicated, that's always tied to political responsibility but is always politically invisible, these require an understanding of how institutions evolve over time and how different institutions fit together. And they need an understanding of how society works, of how family structures work, of power dynamics, and all these things that economics has not been able to do. Now, for quite a while, our policymakers have been protecting the limitations of this belief system by lashing out at the systems that I'm talking about that can't be ended. But all they've really done is generate sufficient crisis that we have to examine these institutions. And then with Brexit, we have generated the framework for that crisis. And as a catalyst event, it's fucking enormous, by the way. But Brexit is now the framework within which we will address this institutional failure. Now, we will largely be doing this while we deal with other crises. But what we will have to do in this process is jump from, we cannot manage Brexit with the economics that we have. We haven't had institutional economists at the core of things for 30, 40 years. We've been experimenting with institutional reforms with no basis in evidence at all and no understanding of how institutions function. And because of Brexit, and not because of the system failure that I am discussing, but because of Brexit, which is a crisis which seems unrelated but is still caused by the politics of blame, we have created a framework where we have to leave that belief system because we cannot manage the tasks that Brexit will give us in redefining and unpicking the EU from our institutions. We can't do that with that belief system. Now, what that means is that in the think tanks and the policymakers who've all come from the 3 or 4 universities where they don't do this, the very elite universities where they haven't been considered institutions, they don't know this yet. And much of this they will experience as threats to their own professional or political identity. But that shift has to occur. Now, Minsky described a process by which, after World War II, we forgot the lessons that Keynes was trying to say and we went back into old rhythms. Well, we all know this. We actually do this as people, and this is very likely to happen again. So we are very likely to go into a period of crisis where we have to see what these systems do expose, the way that we're all connected and within the same systems is exposed, and where these power dynamics expose themselves and force a reconstruction in lots of people's understanding of power. And this is likely to happen, and this is necessary for us to redefine these institutions. But then when we return to stability, what we will do is we will just drift back to doing it the way that we always did. And that's because the way that we think during periods of stability is very, very different to the way we think during periods of crisis. Now, one of the things that has to happen, when the context that has changed around this economic is so related to people, like women and changing roles of women, you know, in the emergence of equality legislation, of rights for different groups, because this is the context that has changed around these models, what this crisis also has to do is force us through this period to allow us a framework where we can incorporate that into our thinking. But in order for that to happen, the other way of doing things has to break down. And for the people who are at the core of this is going to feel like the end of the world. It's not. It should be very, very quick. Because we have to abandon the belief system for the period of stability to accommodate this crisis. And meantime, this crisis is exposing all these fucking power relations, and everybody wants someone to blame, and everyone's feeling stabby death. But within that process, probably while we're not even paying attention, we'll accommodate the shifts that have already occurred first. So before we start dealing with crisis caused by things that we don't know about, we will have to accommodate the shifts that have already occurred that we did not want to look at. And so that's what I'm going to start looking at in my next video.